Hello, good morning everyone. As you're joining us this morning, welcome to the Regen event on onshore wind in England. We've got a few people joining today, so we're going to wait only 2 minutes for everyone to get online. If you have, well, in the meantime, if you've got a bit of time, then please use the chat function in Zoom to sort of converse amongst yourselves. So say hi, let us know where you are and how windy and sunny it is today. So you can use the chat function throughout this to have conversations. We're just going to wait a few more moments. It's very sunny in Jersey. Good to see. Bit grey further north. Oh, it's grey in Southampton. That's surprising. Okay, so it's grey everywhere. Right, we're just going to wait 1 more minute and then we will kick off the event. I'm hoping, given it's so grey everywhere, that it's going to get a bit sunnier later. Great, thank you for the chat, everybody. So welcome to this Regen event on onshore wind in England and sponsored by Thrive Renewables. I'm Poppy Morby, the head of cities and regions at Regen, and I'm going to be chairing our event today. So for those of you that don't know us already, Regen are not-for-profit energy experts. We have a mission to achieve a net zero energy system, and we do this by working with lots of different people and organisations to try and solve some of the trickier issues in policy and practice around energy. So we do events, we have membership, including for local authorities. We also run the electricity storage network. So we do lots of different things. And I lead our work on supporting local authorities and regions in particular with their net zero ambitions. So on to the topic of today. We want to talk about onshore wind in England. Hannah, can you put the first slide up, please? So we know this is the cheapest renewable technology at the moment. It's very quick to put up in theory, and this nice global wind atlas shows basically how abundant the resource is in the UK. It illustrates that sort of huge resource quite nicely. But as we know, onshore wind is effectively banned at present. Slide 2, please, Hannah. Essentially, through the planning system, we know that one objection pretty much can derail a project. And Catherine, our speaker later, has a rather depressing example of someone actually cutting their hedge so they could claim to be visually impacted by the site. And the results, I guess, of that policy is basically as shown on this infographic, that there are no or very few onshore wind projects in the UK. And for someone that's really keen to see the UK achieve net zero and sooner rather than later, also facing a sort of cost of energy and energy security crisis, this lost opportunity really just feels like a terrible waste. So on to slide 3. And just on the back of that, we've been on a bit of a policy roller coaster over the last couple of weeks. We've had our hopes rather dashed, I guess, with the energy security strategy that came out a week or so ago. Still, we think there was a little bit of a chink of light in that, and we're hoping we can start exploring that a little bit today. So I'm, I guess, a bit of an optimist about this. We should recognise that onshore wind was in the strategy, which is an improvement. And it has a couple of commitments here around supporting a number of new local projects with strong local backing. There was also a commitment to support the technology through CFDs. There's a note about supporting repowering of older sites, which we'll hopefully talk a little bit more about later on. And then a lengthy section, but essentially a commitment to consult this year on developing local partnerships for a limited number of supportive communities who wish to host an onshore wind infrastructure in return for benefits, including lower energy bills. So this sort of community benefit from onshore wind, in fact, actually from all renewable generation, is something that Regen have been supporting over many years. And it sits really right in the center of our mission, which is to decarbonize, decentralize and democratize energy. You really have to bring people along with you on this journey. But hopefully we can have a little bit of a think today about what that means in practice and what this commitment in the strategy could involve. So we're going to have hopefully an open discussion today with a number of experts. And as an optimist, it'd be nice to think about this as a potential for a brighter future for the technology. So there's two questions that we wanted to explore today in particular. So how can we build on that policy chink in the strategy to something where we can start to see new projects in England? And secondly, from a local authority perspective, what is the local authority role and what can they do to support this technology in their area? So on to the agenda. Thanks, Alan. I've already done my introduction, but we have another 4 speakers for you today who are all working to make onshore wind projects a reality. And their sessions will be followed by a panel session where we can explore some of the themes and some of the questions from you all. So on that note, we have the Q&A function in Zoom. If you could use that to ask questions directly to me as the chair or a number of our panelists, then that would be fantastic. So please put those up as we're going through the presentation. As things occur to you, we will review those and hopefully use them to initiate our panel session at the end. So our speakers, we have Catherine from Burge Salmon, who are going to be sharing some of her legal experience of developing projects in Wales, and particularly how communities can be more meaningfully involved in those. That's going to be followed by 2 presentations sharing learnings and lessons from 2 new onshore projects, possibly, we think, the only 2 onshore projects currently in England. So that's the community-owned Bristol turbine. So David and Charles are going to be taking us through their approach and their business case development. And Will Bond is going to be talking about a project, the Alaska farm, that he's been trying to develop since 2003, he tells me, taking us through the lengthy process that, to achieve planning and how he's doing on building that site, we hope, in the next year. Then we have Monica from Thrive, who's going to be reflecting on the business case and giving us a bit of an investor perspective. So I'm going to hand over now to Catherine.
Excellent. Good morning, everybody. There we go. I'm sure we've all read the document, and while Poppy is ever the optimist, I think it's fair to say I was not surprised by how unhelpful the energy security strategy was for wind, but I'm not surprised, but very disappointed. I have been working in wind for more than a decade now, working to get projects consented, and we've seen a lot of change, and I'm doing a lot on wind farms in Wales at the moment, which just goes to show how a change in policy really does benefit the industry. So if you could go to the next slide, I'm just going to give a very brief overview. The energy security strategy on the 7th of April, I think we all had very high expectations about what it could do. And wind is the cheapest, it's very productive, and it was disappointing that politics, I think, has got in the way here. There are, it is politically unpopular with those people predominantly that have second homes in nice parts of Cornwall, and for some reason they feel that wind energy isn't what they want to see. So the security strategy has left a chink that we should really look to exploit now, and to lobby our communities and the government to do more. So it talks about plans to support local projects and local communities in control, which I think they already are through the NPPF, but we'll come on to that. It's going to have consultations to develop local partnerships with supportive communities. So I think that's really where the local authorities need to come forwards and say, this is what we want. And we need to make sure that that supportive community is able to voice its support without being shouted down by those that are against, because as we all know from planning, there's never anything that pleases everybody. Somebody is always objecting to even the most simple planning application. And it is going to examine arrangements to support repowering of existing onshore wind. Now, we need to just make sure that that examining of the arrangements is actually supporting the repowering of onshore wind in the best possible way, which potentially could be bigger but fewer turbines on the same areas of land when repowering is needed. And there's a lot of schemes that are going to come up for repowering in the next few years, because they were all built pre-2015 really, when the government shut down onshore wind in England to all intents and purposes. So there's positivity there, but I think it really is going to have to be driven by local authorities and local communities to make these things happen. The government haven't made it easy. They're not going to. They haven't opened the floodgates, and I think it's incumbent on local authorities to really bring their communities with them. So, if on the next slide, I've set out what the NPPF has had in it for a number of years now, in relation to policy making. In that, to a certain extent, local authorities have already had the powers available to make their local plans renewable friendly, and there is already an obligation there to do that. Now it's I know there's a bigger issue with plan making and the various changes that have been brought in and requirements, but I think it's there. So it was a bit woolly in the NPPF, consider identifying suitable areas for renewables. You can identify those areas, and I think local authorities need to think carefully about how they go about that now, because we're seeing, well, I'll talk about it when we move on to top tips at the end. But those are so you already have the powers to be able to do that, and maybe looking at community-led initiatives for renewables. Yes, we should do that. But if we're also going to maximise the potential, then I think those community-led initiatives probably need to be done in conjunction with the larger energy providers, so that we get the scale there. So the policy making, it's all there. The energy strategy supports that. If we move on to the next slide, I think this is the challenging one, isn't it? The decision-making point, where you can only approve the application if its impacts are or can be made acceptable. And that beautiful footnote 54 that we've all been living with, that really I was hoping would be taken away in the energy security strategy, but it hasn't been. And therefore, I think the piece at the end really where you've got to demonstrate planning impacts identified by the local community have been fully addressed and the proposal has their backing. And that's the challenge. But I think that's where it requires now, local authorities and community groups to lead that charge and work with developers, so that the minority of people who are objecting can be it can be put in context, and what is fully addressed, who knows, but I'm sure that will come through. So I'm aware of time, so if we just move on to the next slide, because I think that's all things we all know, and this is top tips from my perspective of seeing how the onshore wind renaissance in Wales is happening. So in Wales, they have got pre-assessed areas which have replaced the TAN8 areas from a decade ago. But I think I would say just be careful about drawing a line on a map. The pre-assessed areas that have been identified in Wales after some high-level desktop studies, when the developers have gone to site and carried out all the other constraint mapping, in particular putting on residential visual amenity buffers, the pre-assessed areas have shrunk so much that they're not really developable without going on land outside the pre-assessed areas. So it's that tension between, which has always existed in planning policy and plan making, between drawing lines on maps and going in this general area, or setting out a criteria-based system and then enabling policies that allow developers to bring forward sites where it's appropriate, taking into account all the constraints. So it's much more than a line on a map. I think, be ambitious and be flexible, because that sends the message to the communities that this is something we're in favour of. And then both local authorities, but also developers, and I think developers are doing it, they've learnt, and the industry's matured. So I think meaningfully engaging with the community and engaging early about what it is that they want from a scheme, and giving some proper consideration to what benefits schemes can deliver. We're seeing, it's much more than here's a £5,000 per megawatt into a community fund and everybody can have, the church halls have all had their roofs done, the community centres are up and running. It needs to be a bit more than that now. Is there an element of, can the community have some ownership of the wind farm? Is there, certainly in Wales, there's a critical number of projects being brought forward by developers. That means they're able to think about doing things like offering apprenticeships, or not necessarily job creation, because the supply chain issues are always there, but also about bringing in, if they're going to get consent for five wind farms, can they actually create a hub and employ locally within Wales, because that's what Wales is very keen on. So I think it is really, and they are listening and they're being creative, I think, as well with what can be done with the resources. So I think it's for me, there is a possibility there, and there is a real, I think we need to do a bit more selling of the industry to the community in terms of what are their options to meet net zero, and wind farm applications are still temporary permissions, and so there is no need necessarily for them to be extended at the end in 50 years if there is an alternative renewable energy source, which the other industries, which are slower and trying to catch up with, they may well replace them.
Thank you, Catherine. It's really interesting, I think, to see some of these lessons coming from Wales. And I think obviously Wales and Scotland have both been pushing ahead with onshore wind, while England has not. So is there anything in particular from the policy perspective in Wales that you think that they have a community ownership target, for example? Is that?
They do. I think that is focusing developers' minds in terms of what can they deliver to the community, because the community are actually sitting there saying, we don't need another community hall. It's got a new roof. It's got the latest equipment. What more can you do? And Wales are very keen to keep the money in Wales and circulating in Wales and profitability, because it is very often that wind farms, particularly in Wales on the uplands where it's windy, are in the deprived areas where it's actually more about job creation and energy bills and community facilities more broadly. And I think that has helped, but it's requiring developers to really think, and they are, and they're coming up with some really creative and really beneficial things for the community.
Yeah, that's really great to see. Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to hand over now to our pair from Bristol, who are going to give us their thoughts on how to get a wind turbine built. Dave.
I'll let Charles open this.
Sorry, Charles.
You want to unmute yourself, Charles? You have to press on.
You muted me immediately. Hi, I'm Charles Gamble of Community Power Solutions. Renaissance, rebirth. Well, I'm old enough and fortunate enough to have been around at the birth. We are in an energy transition, and onshore wind must be one of our tools in that transition, I believe. Let me tell you a story. Next slide, please. I was born in a coal mining community, and what you see on the screen is where I spent my life. Like many thousands, my family produced the coal that drove industry. I became a young engineer in one of these 1960s cathedrals to energy. In a coal-fired power station, about a third of the energy in the coal goes up the chimney with all the CO2, SO2, and so on. Almost half the remaining energy in the coal is dumped into cooling towers or the river, and some of the remainder ends up as electricity. It seemed a heck of a waste, but the best we could do at the time. Typical coal-fired power plants operating at that time at steam pressures of 170 bar and 570 C converted between 35 and 38% of the heating value of the fuel into usable energy. Modern nuclear plants, just as a side note, actually achieve a lower efficiency, 30 to 32%, all of the rest being heat in the environment. I may be preaching to converted, but these coal-fired power stations are rightly part of history, at least in England. Next slide, please. Fast forward 10 years. It's the 1980s. California tax credits led to thousands of turbines being built. This market kick was both crucial and mad. Many turbines evolved from an agricultural and boat building background. Many failed. Here also are some of the state-of-the-art turbines at the time, a triumph of good UK engineering, years ahead of its time. So as a power station trained engineer, I'm sitting on top of this one here, the one with the arrow. The westerly winds bring the fog in to San Francisco Bay and pour inland. And this little turbine, just 250 kilowatts, was converting invisible air into invisible electricity, just like that. I was hooked. The point is, so should you be. And so I spent the last 40 years in the wind industry. Next slide, please. The industry is now what you could say mature. So there are wind power stations onshore in the UK. This is Whiteley's in the Scottish Lowlands. But of course, this is corporate wind, not community wind. And because of our population density, large projects are now offshore where the scale is truly gigantic and showing no signs of slowing down. Next slide, please. So onshore wind, we absolutely need a rebirth. Last year, it produced 11% of our electricity in the UK. A good start, but not enough. We must dispel the myth, perhaps, although the first slide of the entire seminar did. There's plenty of wind resource available. A recent study by the University of Sussex and Denmark's Aarhus University has found that if wind farms were established on available and appropriate land, and I'll leave it to the lawyers to define that one broadly, they could meet 140% of the UK and Ireland's energy demand, 140%. How to enable that? Well, in Germany, for example, community wind has very high social acceptance. Hundreds of thousands of people have invested in citizens' wind farms, and citizens' energy accounts for around half of renewable power capacity. In Denmark, that figure is 80%. So our story with Ambition Community Energy's turbine is great, but it's also sad, as it's a rare success despite England having an excellent wind resource. So how did the Ambition Community Energy turbine happen? It all goes back to an active resident of Ambition Lawrence Weston, Roger, who has a view from his window of corporate wind turbines in Avonmouth. In a pub after a neighbourhood development meeting, he pushed the idea that we, our community, can own one of those. At the same time, Bristol City Council asked for a desktop study on building a medium-scale wind turbine on their land, somewhere in Bristol. So David contacted me. Now I'd retired from the wind business and was volunteering, but I said, if you can get planning, I'll build a wind turbine. There's no point in building a medium-scale turbine. It's going to be a big one. Now, it only takes 6 things to build a corporate, shall I say, wind turbine: planning permission, finance, wind, turbine, grid connection, and an energy off-taker. None of these are simple. But in reality, for community wind, the community has to come first. So the first step is we agreed a corporate structure that works for the community. We created Ambition Community Energy as an asset-locked CIC, wholly owned by Ambition Lawrence Weston. It was set up to protect the interests of the community. Its entire raison d'etre is to provide real benefits to the community it serves. There are no shareholders. David, over to you. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Charles. Yes, as Charles mentioned, Charles was volunteering with Bristol Energy Network, and I've been working with Ambition Lawrence Weston since 2014, from running a fuel poverty workshop where I introduced community energy to their community plan, and community energy got updated into their community plan as they realised its significance in terms of realising their ambitions to regenerate Ambition Lawrence Weston. So here's Mark Pepper committing to the onshore wind turbine, to build their onshore wind turbine to enable the education of the community around opportunities from the net zero opportunities. So we're going to build a visiting centre as part of this, and an energy learning zone, but also focusing on how we can end fuel poverty, and that's why that commitment's there. And Mark's well on the way with the new climate action plan that we've just recently published. You can go to Ambition Lawrence Weston's website and find that there. But ultimately, this is where we need to be looking. We need to be investing in those communities, those ex-coal mining communities, those coastal communities where the wind resource is good, but also the communities are in need of this regeneration. And if we give them the resources, they can lead these projects. And that's what we've proven with our project, is if we have the resources, we can do this. So community energy is an important vehicle, and this is why government needs to put it into their strategy. The next energy strategy is too far away. We need to bring forward this now. It's a climate emergency. Communities like this deserve better, and now fuel poverty is on the rise. We need to involve these communities. So I spent the first year with Ambition Lawrence Weston through it was presented to me from Ambition Lawrence Weston. They wanted to do this project after we just developed a 4.2 megawatt solar farm with Bristol Energy Cooperative. They said, we want the next one to be owned wholly by ourselves. Can you build us a wind turbine? So I got in touch with Charles. And then, and then the opportunity came up with Urban Community Energy Fund was coming to an end. And Dan Stone presented the idea of actually us developing a strategy to overcome the barriers to onshore wind. And that's where I applied for that funding. I was successful, and I was able to appoint Womble Bond Dickinson to actually support us through that planning strategy, and also LB planning. I'll come back to that in the conclusions later. But so the next slide, please. So undertaking this was a really important part of the work we did. So for the first year, just understanding the written ministerial statement and demonstrating that local support. We had already done a neighbourhood plan, but what like was said earlier, if you draw the lines, the neighbourhood plan being drawn before the ministerial statement, so we need to create a new one. So we didn't really want to go back through that process. So we continued with our community engagement. We built up the support for onshore wind, and then Accolade Wines came along with Clean Earth Solution. I can't remember their name. Sorry. Clean Earth, and they put forward their turbine, but hadn't done that community work, and we held back our community engagement because we really wanted to see community benefit coming back to Ambition Norwich Western. That wasn't forthcoming. We decided in the end we wanted to see a wind turbine, and we submitted our support for that project, and lo and behold, it got through, and that proved to us that we could do what we wanted to do. So we carried on with our environmental studies, and what that really shows really is if you've got supportive statements in the local plan for onshore wind and renewable energy, you can progress and demonstrate this. You can go.
I think we may have lost Dave. Apologies. Charles, could you?
I can pick up.
Okay.
If I would try and get him back. Next slide, please. Thanks, David. I'm sure you've got the conclusion anyway, so you will not be cutting you off. Our seed money came from the government's Urban Community Energy Fund. Don't we need that to be reinstated? That enabled us to create a business plan around a number of options, of which there are quite a few. The most difficult money to raise is the risky development finance. Our business plan was, however, pretty convincing. It's a vital bedrock you have to always go back to. So we're grateful to support the Community Resilience Fund from Council, Power to Change, Bristol and Bath Regional Capital, Bristol Community Energy Fund for listening to our pitch at various times, coming on board over a period of time and making this possible. But that was undoubtedly the hardest time when we had a vision. We'd spoken about it, David engaged the community. We had to fund the development to ensure that we could deliver. Our development budget was stretched as we came across unexpected issues and costs, but it took us through a complete environmental impact assessment. We've got some great consultants working with us, and it took us through a successful planning application, which was recommended refusal by the officers, but unanimously approved by the committee. So as we came to define our need for construction finance, senior debt was arranged with Thrive Renewables, and you'll hear from them later. And Bristol and Bath Regional Capital came in again with junior debt. We'd also secured a £500,000 capital grant from West England Combined Authority as part of ERDF funds. So heartfelt thanks from us to all of those who helped us to see it through. Now, next slide, please. Number 4, wind. Wind should be at the top or somewhere around community because it's the only one you can't change. Maybe you can't change it. Anyway, it's the only one. Everything else is negotiable. We were offered parcels of council land, many parcels of council land for a desktop study. So the first report in the business plan was a top-level assessment of the wind regime to check what might work. Many sites were considered and quickly rejected. All of the sites I looked at had varieties of constraints, so one has to be systematic and look for the extent to which each might affect the project. And we had habitation, to access, national infrastructure, SSI, heritage sites, Ramsar, everything. And of course, noise, local habitations, turbines don't get put up next to habitations. We drew up a short list of sites and refined a financial model and chose the current site, even though it was very highly constrained. Chiefly, the wind speed is IEC class 3, no matter how high we could put the turbine, which is tough to make work really in what was then an unsubsidized no post-feed-in tariff regime. It's also downwind and close to existing Bristol City Council pair of turbines. Next slide, please. So Once upon a time, turbines were risky. Now they are high-tech commodities in serial production. They perform well. Californian turbines at that time would probably have an availability of about 60%. Now one would be seriously annoyed if the turbine availability on a modern turbine didn't reach 99%. We were able to engage with 4 major turbine manufacturers, despite this being a single machine. That's quite difficult. Most turbine manufacturers are not interested in a single machine, but if onshore wind takes off, they will come back. We went through an OJU tender process and selected the Enercon E115. That's 115 meters diameter, 4.2 megawatts, rating 92 meters high, tower 150 meters to the tip. You know, there are not many turbines available, and larger than that, you might not be able to get on land, because getting turbines up country lanes isn't easy. And smaller than that, you might find that manufacturers aren't making anymore. Industry's
Charles,
moved on.
just to say, if we could
Okay.
get to the end quickly, that'd be good.
In that case, I'm going to skip over and hand back to David. I'll skip over grid and PPA. David.
Oh, you do grid, Charles. Very quick.
All right. I'll skip over this because we're running out of time. I don't want to labor it. The regulations and grid codes are very well codified. It's not simple, but we navigated our way through the G99 process and carried out all the necessary electrical performance studies to prove compatibility with the grid. The next one. Similarly.
Okay, I'll do this one then. Okay,
Please
so
do. Thanks, David.
yeah, so the PPA arrangements are really important. So making sure that you've got a bankable PPA, because there are no subsidies. One of the things we realised that we needed a bankable PPA. We went out to long-term bankable institutions, hospitals, local authorities, and so on. And so we do have a PPA arrangement where we can get a long-term PPA. But it is disappointing that government's not allowed a community CFD contract for difference, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And that's something we need to really push for. So yeah, if you can get a private wire, brilliant, and if you can match the demand to local consumers, you can do an energy local model, but that's very difficult, quite rare at the moment. Though there are some great examples in Dorset recently. Next slide. Okay, so in conclusion, really, the reason why we're in the position we're in is because of what happened in 2015. We need a renaissance of climate emergency, if we said. So we don't just need warm words from government anymore. We need to see action. We need to see actual investment in community energy. We've proven that communities can deliver if they're invested in, and that's really what's missing from the community energy strategy. Well, from the energy strategy is a community energy strategy and an action plan funded. So we need a new joined up funding stream, one that I fashioned in Bristol. We can do it again in Bristol in the southwest, but we can't do it elsewhere in the country because of the restrictions on local funders that I've been engaging with. We also need reinforcement of the grid. Actually, the Ofgem needs to require the DSOs to actually invest in reinforcing the grid connections. None of us are going to get to net zero if we can't connect properly to things. So we need that from Ofgem now to take action for us to be able to do that, and to actually preferentially look at community energy and renewables over fossil fuels. Crazy. And we need this local energy bill. We want to benefit the communities where we're generating in, and again, crazy that we're not in a position to be able to do that. So we need a community energy bankable long-term floor price for energy, so that we can go to a bank and say we've got a project, and then we can get that at-risk finance sorted. But we need the at-risk finance from a new community wealth fund. We need at-risk finance. It's not just good enough to give us capital, because we won't develop anything. So I'm really encouraging government now to, I know some government officials will be listening to this, to update the planning system. We need to streamline that, engage your officers. If government's not going to do this, it needs to be local authorities that are doing this, and working with the Bay Southwest Energy Hub. Need to identify, as was mentioned earlier, the criteria for wind. We don't necessarily need lines all over the place, but we do need this to happen now. And this will only happen, this actual energy transition in the way that it needs to happen if we involve communities. So I encourage not just warm words, but investment in community energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. We will, it's just very inspiring to see a project that has got off the ground on onshore wind, and hopefully we'll get lots of questions for you later, but I'm going to crack on now and get Will up to present about Alaska.
Thanks, Poppy. I should reiterate that I'm an individual farmer and landowner. I speak only for myself. To start with, I'm going to set the scene for my project. I set up a joint venture with a conventional wind developer in 2003 and applied, it took us a while, but we applied in 2009 for planning consent for 4 2.3 megawatt turbines in a disused quarry here. It's a slow burn project. Next slide, please, Hannah. Still underway. We're reflecting changes in the market. We're now using secondhand turbines, 2 megawatts, because that's what we could get. The towers were delivered in December, a beautiful December day here when they came in, and the drivetrains and the blades are being refurbished at the moment. Next slide, please. One complication that I added was the demand to share a grid connection with a potential solar project on my land. To my simple mind, digging up 5 miles of road twice, installing tons of copper and aluminium wire twice, and so on, was not really necessary, and so bad for sustainability. This is the route from the wind farm and solar through to the Wareham DNO. I have to admit, with hindsight, the industry has not yet caught on to my way of thinking, and it is a brake on the progress of the project. I still think it's the right thing to do, but maybe I'm ahead of my time. Next, please. So turning to public perceptions, I've had 13 years now to listen to how they evolve. In 2009, the fossil fuel PR machine was churning out any story that might muddy the waters, amusingly, including the conspiracy theories now recycled as COVID conspiracies about a political and capitalist plot to take control of the world. Climate change in 2009 was both widely recognised and widely denied. And even as late as 2012, the planning appeal, CPRE were putting up expert witnesses to deny the need to take any action at all on climate change. And they also gave evidence that Dorset's target to generate 7.5% of its energy from renewable sources was unnecessarily ambitious. Well, that was one side in 2009. But despite those negatives, I was surprised and delighted that the local groundswell didn't really kind of get its act together to oppose the wind farm. And more widely, we had a lot of enthusiastic support. Indeed, of the 705 written submissions to the Planning Authority, 75% were in support of the application. That's even in 2009. While a petition against the wind farm, the planning officer said, had been inflated by duplicating several pages of signatures. And I found that hugely encouraging, that if the opposition resort to fiddling their numbers, it's surely a sign of frustration on their side. So, move forward to 2022. What's changed? Well, the climate change debate ought not really to feature, certainly in a planning inquiry. Frustratingly, dinosaurs like the Koch brothers in the United States, Gina Reinhardt in Australia, and shadowy figures in Russia still have vested interests to try to preserve the fossil fuel industry by denying climate change and by pumping out the information against anything that threatens them, including wind farms. And those donations to the kind of think tanks that they claim to be, they still run into hundreds of millions of dollars every year. And that, of course, must have an impact globally. But closer to home, people who 10 years ago were giving some real stick about the wind farm, being quite abusive, now stop me in the street and say, when are you going to get those turbines up? It's about time you got on did it. And I think there comes a point when they accept that change is going to happen. And actually what they want to do is get to the next stage, to get beyond it and get the change out of the way. So views obviously do change as we go along. Not surprisingly, given the profile of climate change and biodiversity crisis, public support is even higher now than it was, and with a real sense of urgency. But there are always going to be those who are close to any development who feel they may be affected and have concerns. That's entirely reasonable. The problem is we still have an anti-wind farm lobby who lock onto those people, pour petrol on the flames and enjoy the conflagration. And I really think it is very, very unfair on those who don't know who to believe, don't know whether they should be worried or not. A slightly different tangent of the public perception is the effect on the local planning authority. We find that getting conditions signed off has become a cause of delay to the wind farm because the local planning authority are frightened of legal challenges. They don't dare move unless they've checked every dot and T and everything else. But those challenges don't actually come from members of the public. They come from a lobby group. And while I don't want to upset the whole audience at this stage, I've got to say my perception is that while planners are scared of lobbyists, we'll struggle to reach 1.5 degrees. We can't work fast enough. And to illustrate the point that there are really only a limited number of players in these games, if I can call it that, here's a photo of some stickers applied to road signs around us. At the very top of the picture, you can see two stickers, one stuck on top of the other, because one was put up and about 50 stickers were put up one morning by two people. That's all it takes. A couple of people, one driving, one jumping out, putting stickers up, 50 done in a couple of hours. It looks like there's widespread opposition, but it only takes two people a couple of hours. But then the supporters come along. It takes them even less time with a can of spray paint. Not quite yet, Hannah, back one, please. To spray out the first sticker. So then a second sticker gets put on top. That gets sprayed out. A third sticker gets put on, and so on. And it is just a war between two very small numbers of people. But you can see to the right of that lower one, a bit of black insulating tape. Now we can move on a slide. And no becomes now. Perhaps I chose the wrong one to take the picture of, but you get the gist of it. It's actually quite amusing in its own way. But it does show this battle between very small numbers of people to try and influence the opinion that there is something big going on. So last slide, please. After 13 years of watching this push and pull, my conclusion is that the battle is between the wind farm supporters, that's the developers and the Greens, and the opponents fed largely through support from devious channels by the fossil fuel PR machine. If I were to describe the local planning authority and the local public as pawns in the battle, it sounds callous, but to a degree they are, and to their great disadvantage. And here in my final slide, here's a lobby group making a naked threat to use their access to resources to force the LPA's hand. For onshore wind to develop fully, we need to stop the disinformation machine. We need to get factual, balanced information to the public at a time when they need it. And the same goes for those MPs who fall for the line that voters don't want wind. And we need to facilitate getting planners away from their defensive positions so they can actually do something. Community projects, such as just described, are one excellent way of pushing back, probably not the only one, because other projects are riskier and perhaps need the commercial input. But I think I've now insulted the whole audience, so I'll stop digging and say thank you very much.
Thank you, Will. As a local resident, I take great pleasure in seeing the now stickers on the back of the signs across Dorset. So that's a really interesting just review of some of the public opinion that you've been facing over the last couple of years, and also very interesting, I guess, to hear the role of the local authority in that, which and the position that they've been sort of pushed into to some extent. I'm going to move on now to Monica to give a bit of a reflection, and then we can start asking some questions.
Great, thanks, Poppy. And yeah, wow, it was so inspiring to hear everybody's stories so far, and it just feels like everything's there technically, financially. The will, public support even now is increasing, and there's just something like a wall around us, and how to get to the next level. So it's just a short reflections from myself and Thrive. Next slide, please. So just very quickly about us. We are a company based in Bristol, focused on investment into renewable energy projects. What is unique about Thrive is we are owned by 6,000 individual shareholders, and we've been investing in projects since 1995. So we've got some of the oldest wind projects in England as well. And we've built a portfolio of wind, solar, and most recently battery storage. Next slide, please. The way we've been investing in projects, we always say it's for us it's important projects happen and the impact that they can create. So we've been trying to be quite flexible on how we can invest, and here's a range of different types of sort of financing products. So we either come in and acquire projects 100%, and then we run and operate them. We also very open to people staying involved, so either developers or landowners in the kind of long-term projects as well. We are very keen on supporting communities by providing finance to projects such as the project that was mentioned by Charles and David, and we're absolutely thrilled to see progress happening at Avonmouth on this turbine. We also provide senior and mezzanine loans to some projects. So this is for those that want to maintain ownership and just need the finance. And also joint ventures with communities, with developers, with other investors. And the other side, which I think is also quite important, is the private wire, because this is something that can generate real local benefits for communities and for businesses that have direct connections from wind or solar projects. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I kind of was trying to think about what would bring together different kind of aspects, what we've all been talking about, and where the benefits really are of onshore wind. And what is amazing is that after 20 years of wind establishing itself in UK as a mature industry, really, we are able now to take this to the next step without any subsidies and in a truly market way, which would deliver very much reduced energy prices and so on in UK. So many things have been said today, but I just thought that that sort of circular virtuous loop would bring it together. So renewables, and especially wind, provides an opportunities for local businesses to get involved, either into development or into providing services to projects and so on. Local authorities also can benefit from being involved in these projects, either as a landlord, as we've heard from the Avonmouth team, or as an investment opportunity as well into projects, and then seeing benefit in the form of dividends and interest coming from projects. So there's a wide range of benefits that these projects do provide, and it's not just a theory now. We've got 20 years of proven track record in the UK that these projects do deliver that benefit. I guess the question for some of the projects that are coming to an end of its life are now, are we going to stop this loop, or are we going to carry on those sites and allow for repairing and extension of life? Next slide, please. I also wanted to bring some case studies of projects that we have invested in the past. So Meanmore is a wind farm that is a joint venture between 4 community groups in Cumbria. And we've invested in this project by providing a loan, and community over time were able to raise money from community group and refinance our loan, which is great. Ambition Community Energy from Avonmouth, already mentioned. Again, amazing story how working together can bring projects into fruition. Haverick 2 is a project I wanted to bring up because it's an extension of life project. So we came to an end of its planning life after 20-ish years, and we have just gone through the process with the local authority, and we've successfully extended the life of this project by another 15 years. So the existing wind turbines will be kind of reconditioned and some parts replaced, and will carry on working, which is great. And then at the end, Caton Moor, which is already a repowered project 16 years ago, and now we're looking at another phase for this scheme, and hopefully looking at repowering in a few years' time as well. So yeah, that's pretty much end of my presentation, and I'm looking forward to the question session as well.
Thanks, Monica. So I think we're going to bring everyone on screen now, and just to let you know that we'll be sharing all the slides and recording of the session as you would need them. Right, here we are, all on screen. So thanks so much for your presentations. There's a couple of questions have come through, but I guess my first one is just taking us back to the original question about local authorities and what they can do. I think we've heard some examples here of there's sort of legal perspectives, there's planning, there's land, there's just general support. So it'd be good just to get a sense from, I guess, maybe back to Dave and Charles quickly on how you worked with the local authority and what you think the most important role is, or what are the important roles for them.
I'll start with that first, thank you, Charles. Yeah, so I think we're fortunate in Bristol to have a supportive local authority for onshore wind, and they have two of their own onshore wind turbines in Bristol. What I would say about this is an election cycle for local councillors. So I would encourage everyone who's having anyone knocking on their door at the moment, ask them, if you've declared a climate emergency or you're planning to declare a climate emergency, where's your support for onshore wind? How can you involve your officers to take the government funding that is coming through at the moment to actually deploy onshore wind and develop community energy? Because I think those things are where you can start. And I think having a network, Bristol Energy Network, something that I set up in 2010, which enabled me to have the surface area of amazing community experts such as Charles Gamble, where we can, and Andrew Garrett, who I haven't mentioned, he's been an amazing part of this project. He's a director of Ambition Community Energy, and really the first person to really make wind happen. I don't know. Do you want to say something about Andrew there, Charles?
Well, I was fortunate enough to work for Andrew Garrett as part of his Bristol consultancy, Garrett & Son, and I had a few years there, learned a lot, traveled the world multiple times, chewed up enormous amount of carbon in the process, in jet setting basically, but developing wind farms and developing their business. Andrew Garrett has been absolutely great as a member of our board, and he's taken some of the heavy lifting on the contractual side. So thanks to Andrew.
So yeah, so what I'm saying there really is we've had that opportunity because we have a network of community energy practitioners in Bristol, and that could be something that local authorities support across the UK, is supporting community energy infrastructure and capacity building through experts. So we're working with Southport at the moment with a wind turbine there, and their Bays Energy Hub is doing an amazing job in coordinating it in a similar fashion to Bristol Energy Network down in Bristol. So I think these energy hubs play an important role in doing what they're doing, and it takes innovation like Thrive Renewables is doing. We don't have a PPA, but we're working with them to develop that PPA process. So yes, I think it's about having to get your local authority. Take a champion from who is an officer and really support that officer and other officers to navigate the system. And I think education of officers, so it's all of the officers that are involved in the process, from your property team as well as your team around planning and so on, get them involved at the very beginning. That's what I did, and made sure that they understand the nature of the project being a community project, because once you start to get that, I think it's joining up that planning system, and once you've got that joined up approach. But frankly, it's a national government issue. If the government was to take the lead, then if you had a difficult local authority where they weren't being, or they didn't have capacity to do this, when I think that's more and more the cases, they don't have capacity. This is where national government, this is what leadership is about. We need leadership on net zero. We need leadership and support for community energy.
Thank you, Dave. That's a really interesting point about the, I guess, having that strong community and the breadth of sort of knowledge and experience to draw on to try and get everyone on the right page.
I should really say, actually, Ambition Lawrence Weston, the charity, has been key to all of this, and they've been supported by the big local trust. Their funding's coming to an end. We need the big local trust funds coming to an end. We need something to replace that. We need a community wealth fund, so that more communities in coastal communities and left behind communities are actually invested in, and then they have the capacity to engage in these sorts of projects. Otherwise, we just see middle class communities bringing these projects forwards, and not communities such as Ambition Lawrence Weston.
That's a really good point. Thank you, Dave. There was a question, we've had some questions about local authorities and local plans. Catherine, you covered this a little bit in your session about what they can do. Is that local plan the art? Have you seen good examples? Is that the starting point? And I know, Will, Dorset had a target that you were able to use to support your planning, I believe. Catherine, first, from you first, what's your view? Is it about local plans?
Well, yes, it is about local plans. I mean, this planning has always been policy and plan led. So local plans are a key to it. I think local authorities are having a real challenge with local plans generally, and the whole evidence base that needs to go with it. We are seeing some try, but there's a real need, I think, for communities to be pushing their local authorities to be making meaningful policies, criteria based rather than area based, more likely, because otherwise you just end up focusing development in one area, and that area might not be suitable, as we've seen with Wales with the old TAN 8s. They didn't learn, they still did pre-assessed areas, and it's developers that will come in and go, well, this is where, and that's in, but they need a positive enabling local authority who's willing, and I think that's where the energy security strategy may well have some real legs, is where a local authority is willing to put its head above the parapet and go, yes, we want to do it. I mean, it's a climate emergency. Wind turbines take a very small footprint. Quite frankly, you should just be saying, here's our local authority administrative area. We're up for renewables. We're up for onshore wind.
Yeah.
Tell us where you want it.
Yeah,
would that be something in the local plan though, or is there a different, would that have to be a supplementary to a local plan? That
I don't, if you've got to determine planning applications in accordance with your local plan unless there are material considerations. Otherwise, arguably, climate change emergency is a material consideration otherwise. Therefore,
okay.
Well,
So
just to come in on this very briefly. So this is something that we did a lot of work with Bond Dickinson, and we found that as long as we can demonstrate the local support, you've got the support and you phrase the questions correctly, and you actually can demonstrate that it conforms, as mentioned, about climate change and renewable energy mentioned in the local plan, it will go to the Secretary of State. Shouldn't be any reason why it won't be approved, and that's what we've demonstrated with 2 turbines in Bristol that won the accolade. Wine's supported, and now our one. I don't see as much as a barrier as it could be, but for the fact we need planning officers and we need people to actually get on board with this, as was mentioned.
Sorry, Dave, you're breaking up.
I'm sorry. So it's a climate emergency, so the local authority planning officers do need to engage in this way. But ultimately, our turbine did get recommended for approval, but because of a objection from the power station next door, it took the councillors to vote it through. So you still need councillors that support onshore wind And this is why I urge you all today, write to the people that you're thinking of voting for and check what they're actually going to do when they get asked that question.
Poppy,
Thank you.
can I?
Yeah.
And when we originally applied for planning consent, it was under the old planning regime, and we had a planning appeal that was 3 weeks after the National Planning Policy Framework first came in. And we had the excitement while we're getting ready for the planning appeal of reading this new document going to guide the inspector. I can tell you that was pretty exciting, especially when we read about the golden thread of sustainable development. And you go back to those days, it was a very different ball game. And I think it's got watered down and watered down and watered down. And yes, central government needs to get back to putting it where it should be. It should be a priority. Local authorities have their bit to do, but central government has really got to change the way it's doing it.
Thank you, Will. So I guess one of the questions is about how, so we're talking about community support and getting community support, and in the strategy there is something about I guess a recognition of a need to understand what the silent majority might feel about something or might feel about the farm. Do you have, what's been the most successful sort of way of engaging a community? Have you seen examples of where you can get that to accurately reflect that silent majority as opposed to the vocal minority? I'm going to ask, Will.
I was going to say, we had a huge amount of support from our local environmental action group, Purbeck Environmental Action Team, Pete, and they were absolutely brilliant. And the biggest difficulty we had as commercial developer was actually not getting too close to them, making sure they retained their independence and they were able to, well, just be independent. They mustn't be our puppet. And they did so much legwork for us. It was absolutely brilliant. And I think there are, as a private developer, so to speak, there are two elements to it. One is that public support, but the other element is that I personally felt supported as well, because I've got a few aunties who are giving me a lot of stick, who are writing abusive letters to my wife, who are publishing total crap about it. And actually, if you've got a few people who are saying, we really back you, we really, really back you, it is so nice. It is just nice to have somebody behind your back.
That's really good. Yeah, so that local community organisation, it seems like is really important. Dave, did you have objections in Bristol, and how did you?
No, well, what I was going to say is actually that community energy, investing in community energy early on as a local authority and having these conversations over a long period of time. It takes, you've got to do a couple of years of bird surveys, or you need to do at least one. So you have time to engage your community properly. And as long as you phrase your questions correctly, you can demonstrate their support for onshore wind and separate the benefit, community benefit out. So I just think, just start this now. I mean, just start having these conversations now, start evidencing and recording that now. These are, we've got loads of people that are motivated and want to do stuff now. So this is where you can start building up the evidence case now. With groups like Will mentioned, they can start being the foot soldiers and getting the word out there. And it makes sense. The cheapest form of renewable energy is onshore wind.
Yeah. So we had a quick question, I guess, around the idea of financial benefits flowing to communities. So you've got one model there, David and Charles, where you're 100% owning this turbine that goes through to an organisation that has a sort of community strategy, and then that is how the money is given 100%. Out to communities. But there, within the strategy, there was a mention of how they wanted to see those benefits in energy bills or in other ways. I was just wondering, Monica, do you have examples or thoughts of how that could work? Because there are different models, aren't there, that will work for community involvement benefit?
I mean, we've seen different models, of those local benefits. On one hand, yes, there's the community benefits, which just is a annual payment going to a local project or something like that, and we do very much doing that on projects that we've invested in. Something we have launched as Thrive as well is a community, kind of like a group community grant, that we provide grants to communities that are based within a certain radius of our site, and any community can apply for improvements to their community halls and stuff like that. So we've been doing that. I think also private wire type of project where you provide electricity to local businesses or factories and so on. That has also been quite successful, in the sense that those companies buying power a lot cheaper from the turbine they're hosting to what they would have to pay for the grid, and then has impact on, they employ a lot of people, and they can kind of make their own businesses more sustainable. So that's been quite successful. I guess there's lots of questions, and if you want to replicate this model into how the individuals can benefit as well in terms of cheaper electricity bills. At this moment, the system is not set up for that, and I think there is a lot more work that needs to be done on policy and grid, and the sort of those local markets kind of are not really there. It's something that is consulted on at the moment, and in the very early phases. So I just don't know how quickly it can happen, and how real benefits that can generate. But I like the concept, and I think that will be something very very attractive to people. But then there's people. What about people that live in cities? How can they benefit from this? And they might as well be supporting renewables or investing in it. So I guess you have to look at this from different kind of angles, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what to define community?
Yeah, right.
But we won't talk about.
Would it be right just to come in on that briefly? So with our project, we're going to look actually, if you just reduce people's energy bills around the turbine, they might be wealthy individuals who don't necessarily need that money. Whereas if you actually look at, we're creating an energy wallet in Ambition Lawrence Western with Bristol Energy Network, where we're looking at actually targeting support for that through the turbine, and for the wider city, creating an energy learning zone, a visitor centre, because the number of jobs for building the turbine is relatively few, but the skills and requirements for net zero for the whole city is huge, and there's a huge opportunity for for builders and lots of opportunities there. So I think it's about thinking about it in a really holistic manner, and again, not just picking up on one particular marketing drive, but actually genuinely involving those communities. And that's why I keep going back to investing in community energy.
Thanks, Dave. Catherine, have you seen any good examples of this sort of, other than, like you said, do a new roof and give a bit of more money to the Scout Hut? What have you seen coming out in Wales?
Yeah, so we're seeing serious consideration now by developers to offer graduate programs or training programs, apprentices, jobs coming in, but also in terms of supporting colleges in much the same way that Hinkley's done with the new nuclear, needing to build those skills, developing the courses in local colleges for the local children to be able to access easily. Community ownership in Wales is a big thing, and the Welsh government are very, very keen on that. And we're seeing, we've got one developer is working with a community group to say, look, do you want to have the equivalent of a turbine with us, and you can take the money and distribute it as you need, and there then the community is looking at retrofitting of houses and supporting energy efficiency measures. So it's all going in the right direction, rather than another community centre with a new roof, because they everybody's got those now, especially some, and the challenge is how big is that community, because some of the communities, especially in rural areas, are very small, and then the pots of money get very big very quickly, especially with the newer schemes coming through with bigger turbines and a bigger megawatt. So it is looking more broadly at what can be done on an environmentally responsible basis. And communities are on the whole, they are positive and want to see it. Yes, we can't hide from the fact we can all see wind turbines. We can't hide them with a tree or a hedge. So we have to look at them. But I think we're a good 10 years down the line now as well. We've got a generation of children for whom wind turbines are the norm. And my 5 and 3-year-old, we spot them as we drive around, and what do they want? They need a world that they can exist in, and that means we all need to treat the climate emergency as an emergency.
Yeah. So that sounds interesting in terms of that there is a move now that would have communities part owning these sites as well as fully, or certainly getting a revenue benefit from the sites.
Yeah, I think there's an issue with I think there's an issue with actual ownership sometimes, because that causes problems with ongoing maintenance and liabilities and things. But certainly, giving them a bigger say and a definite revenue stream, it is worth it, and it is being looked at, and it is being received quite well. Okay, yeah. One of the areas that we were talking about on our pre-call was about the network and the grid infrastructure. This is something that obviously Regen do an awful lot about. Will, you were alluding to issues that you were having with connecting to the network. What's the solution there? What's the problem there? Have you got any lessons for people?
Well, I mean, the lesson that everybody who's in the renewable industry will know: in southern England, if you haven't already got a connection, get in there if you can get one, because they're like, well, I won't use the phrase I was going to use, but they are rare. I mean, it does seem to me that there is a logic where I took the wind farm and a solar farm, who generate at broadly different periods of the day and different weather conditions, that they should be combining in a single connection. It's got to be more sustainable. But the industry has developed, because of its history and the way it's developed, on the basis of every project has its own connection. And I think the industry needs to move beyond that model now. And I know there are successful ones that have been done, but it clearly is still unusual, and it shouldn't be. It should be something kind of everybody's looking at. Can we combine?
And have you been offered a sort of the non-firm connections? Is that, or a sort of limiting export limitations and things like that?
We've got an extraordinary compound offer, because it's so old and it's been pushed forward so many times. I think it would take a fairly serious lawyer to work out what we actually have got now.
This is Charles at Lawrence Western Community Energy. We applied quite a few years ago now for our first grid connection, and we were offered a constrained, an A&M constrained offer, which meant that the DNO could curtail the machine by about 5%, which is quite a big hit at the time. This is because we were looking at maybe post-feed-in tariff market rates. So 5% was a lot of curtailment. And indeed, even now, there is a system will be built into the DNO substation, which will permit, should that curtailment occur, them to turn down the wind turbine. It won't, because the second report, or rather, let me go back, we were about 24th in the LIFO queue for a connection. So we were down the merit order, but now we're at the top of it. So curtailment is not going to happen, and another report superseded the first. So, but the reason for curtailment in our part of the world was there's too much solar and wind, apparently, according to DNO.
And that's the problem in the southwest. So one of the ways we were going to get around that was putting a 50 megawatt battery in there and connecting to the national grid. And I think really this is where Ofgem really needs to step in and actually start mandating the infrastructure to be upgraded so we can connect. It's a climate emergency, and it's just not good enough. They're not being mandated to be upgraded the network, not maintain it as it is. I'm sure they're going to ask for more money to do that, but again, they're making huge profits. Why we need Ofgem to make those calls now?
So I know we had some chats about repowering earlier and some of the grid implications of that. Sorry, but I think I interrupted you, Catherine. Did you come in with a?
No, it's all right. I was just going to finish on grid, really. It was that, we're seeing, grid is a big constraining issue for all renewable projects. Unfortunately, for us, I think, in this group, the investments being plugged for National Grid to sort out the connections for offshore wind coming to shore. That's probably not surprising given the energy strategy and the political desire that offshore is where they want it to happen quickest. But in Wales, we've always known that mid Wales, there's always been a big grid issue. And we are beginning to see developers now going, right, well, if we've got projects throughout Wales, it's worth us putting in a proper grid line that we will then sell and share with other developers to make this happen. So, if onshore wind in England can come back properly in a coordinated manner, developers are willing to work together to make it happen. So I don't think we do need national government to be saying this is what we want, but I think there are ways it can be brought forwards, kicking and screaming, possibly.
Yeah,
I think that's the point, is we can do it kicking and screaming, and we've proven that with our onshore wind turbine. Why should we do it that way? And again, if we hadn't have got that grid connection, we would have put the 50 megawatt battery in, and we'd have started creating our own local grid. So it's ridiculous.
I mean, that's a really interesting point there, Catherine, about the critical mass that Wales has that allows the community benefits to be deeper and more, more enduring, and that allows things like these grid issues to be dealt with more effectively. And until you get that sort of critical mass for onshore in England, you are still going to be looking at these individual pockets of things, which has its issues, essentially, because you're not getting that economies of scale and ability to get that proper benefit. I was keen to just quickly note on repowering, and I know, Monica, you had some thoughts about the opportunities for repowering. So this is potentially a particularly positive, and it was mentioned in the strategy. Have you got hopes for what that change might be?
I think that there is a huge potential in repowering. There is a number of sites coming to its 20 plus years of operation. As we've heard, it takes quite a few years to develop a project, and I suspect some a level of similar to planning process you still have to go through for the full repowering. I think also commercially and technically, you should be looking at repowering with a latest generation of wind technology, rather than doing a little 600 kilowatts turbines like we've got on some sites that were built 20 years ago. So going, and because the technology has improved so much, you only might need a 50% larger turbines, and you will get 5 times more capacity from it. But then there isn't enough grid on those sites, because those sites were built a long time ago, and just the grid has not been upgraded. So there is a misalignment of the kind of that repowering and the grid availability on some of those older sites. So I think more needs to be done, and definitely from a planning perspective on the ground, as we're going through this process on some of our older sites, there is not unified approach between the different planning authorities, very similar situations in one area that, you know, something is acceptable, in other completely not, and a different process expected to go through. So I think we need to see a more unified repowering strategy. And yes, also, you know, the grid kind of follow that, follow those opportunities. Just talking about the grid and on new sites, I see this everywhere. We've got projects that have planning and just cannot move on because of grid constraints, and it's England, it's also Scotland. I think the more we also get of batteries, which is very good for the, you know, for the energy system, but the more batteries come on, they also will fill up, you know, the grid in various points. So really that is one of the things that, you know, I hope will more investment will come from Ofgem and DNOs.
Well, that would be nice, wouldn't it? So I'm going to take that as your big thing, Monica, because I'm just going to go around the panel now and ask people to sort of sum up on what their biggest thing they would like to see to enable this renaissance, trying to keep it within the realms of what the strategy might allow us to do, perhaps. Or I'll let you do a sort of what pragmatically you would like to do, and then you could do one big in an ideal world, if you like. I'm going to start with, I'll go in order of presentation. So Catherine.
Okay, well, I would like to see these consultations that the government are going to do to be real, meaningful, bucket loads of money, bucket loads of support out there that encourages and looks forwards to not it just being a few pilot areas, but that it's something that every local authority can get involved with fairly easily, without a lot of red tape and barriers, because they're stretched, resources are thin, and that's what I want to see. And then I would actually like to see footnote 54 being deleted.
Thank you. Charles.
Yes, well, I'd like to see, well, I'm a sort of technologist. I'd like to see some education of both the youth and policymakers. Years and years ago, when the company I was with were building the first Welsh wind farms at Cymace and Llangwyryfan, we were assembling the turbines in a factory in Cardiff and put it there through, you know, because I wanted it there. And Gordon Brown, all the politicians turned up. And Gordon Brown turned up, and I had diverted the blade, which was only 12 meters long, into the car park. And he said, "What is that?" I said, "It's a turbine blade." So I do think there's an enormous level of, using the word politely, ignorance among our policymakers and politicians. They simply do not get it. And so my thing would be, I don't know how to do this, because they all went to the wrong universities or the wrong schools. Education would help. You need to get people hooked, as I was, on some passion. That really helps.
Thanks, Charles. David.
Yeah, just reinforcing the 2 points that have already been made. I think having that education and investing in community energy, we need communities to be part of this new decentralized smart local energy system, which is mentioned in the 10-point plan. So let's start engaging them so they actually understand what that means. So that engineer actually knows what's going to happen next in the energy transition. And I just encourage that happen. And as Catherine mentioned, the planning system change, but we need the capacity funding and seed funding to reinstate urban community energy fund. Let's create a new community energy fund and get that funding stream sorted out as they've done in Scotland. We need it here in England.
Thanks. Will.
I think I'd like to see my MP, who is one of those MPs who doesn't really believe in climate change. Depends who he's talking to at the time, I think, but I might be being unfair. I'd like to see all those MPs actually find out the truth, because they are all in the Westminster bubble. They get fed this information from the fossil fuel lobby. They're still getting the disinformation, and they and a lot of other people, I'd like to see an end to disinformation.
That's a good ask. Thanks, Will. And finally, Monica.
I think I have to come to this as a financier. Wind is the cheapest energy source in UK. Allow, this obviously sensitively cited, but a true next revolution for onshore wind in the whole of England, Scotland, and that will deliver cheaper prices for everybody in the whole country. So probably where I am.
Thank you. That's good one to end on. Thank you so much. We are at 11:30, so thank you very much to Thrive. And thank you to all our speakers. That's been a really interesting session. It's really nice to be able to talk about the technology a little bit again, as it's sort of been off everyone's agendas, but let's hope that this is the start of a bit of a renaissance, which would be great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for listening.